Are you frustrated with your little one's progress in PT or in OT? Do you feel like they have plateaued in their progress? Well, if so, if your child is struggling with motor milestone delays and you feel like they are plateauing in their progress, then this video is for you. This video is to help look at what other things can be going on and what may be the root cause to unlocking your potential in motor milestones. So, why do we need motor milestones? Why are motor milestones important? Well, the entire structure of why we develop certain different things at certain times is very intricately designed for our overall development. And so it's one of the reasons why it's important that we go from crawling before we walk, because cross crawling is very important for neurological development. And so important, one, for us to build the brain body connection, because in developing our motor milestones and our motor skills, we're developing those nerves. So the brain has the brainstem, the spinal cord, and out of the spinal cord is the spinal nerves. They go to every cell, muscle, tissue, organ in the body. And those are intricate design pathways where the brain sends a signal to the body sends a signal to the brain. And so motor milestones are a key important thing for us to develop those roadways and those pathways for brain-body communication, and also for neurological development. Another important part is that it really helps build overall development in general. So what goes beyond just motor milestones is really ultimately emotional milestones, behavioral milestones, etc. In the development of movement truly is life. And so the development of movement goes beyond so much more than just movement, but also we see other developmental milestones, and then when we're seeing delays in motor milestones, other developmental delays, whether that be emotional regulation, behavioral issues, etc. We start to see delays in other areas, and it all starts with motor movement milestones. And that's because when babies are little, the first thing they do is they start to hold their head up. And so the first thing they do is motor milestones. And so, besides for eating, sleeping, and pooping, of course, which is very key and the foundation, especially to a healthy child. So, if you are eating, sleeping, and pooping, then beyond that, we want you to be able to hold your head up. And so that's another way we can look at even biggest nerve functioning. But one of the first things you're going to do, you're going to hold your head up way before you start speaking. And so it's an indicator on what's happening beneath the surface. How well is your body hitting these milestones? So some of those milestones that we want to be hitting are holding your neck up, but neck control for things like latch, nursing, and so forth. We want to see the trunk control and the mobility in the upper thoracic spine. And that's when we start to get into tummy time and rolling. And that's really a key indicator on that mobility we have in that thoracic spine, and also the mobility we have in what's called the CT junction, which is the area between the neck and the thoracic spine that's going to help with this extension. And so in order for us to be able to go into tummy time, we have to be able to bring our head into extension. And if there's a lot of tension within the neck, especially, it's going to be very difficult for us to do that. If there's limited range of motion in the thoracic spine, it's going to be difficult for us to go into that posture. And so frequently when kiddos have higher tension, especially high tension in their neck, we'll also see things associated with that, like maybe a tight diaphragm, more spit up, more reflux. And oftentimes those are the kiddos who don't like tummy time. So if your kiddo does not like tummy time and adamantly does not want to do tummy time, it's important for us to look and see where there might be too much tension and where there is mobility issues and where there is too much tone or tension. So that's tummy time. Thoracic mobility then goes into rolling. That's rotation. That happens also in the thoracic spine. We should rotate from our thoracic spine, not from our low back, and our neck also rotates. But when we're moving our body, we're rotating from our thoracic spine or our trunk. So that's our ability to roll. Rolling is very intricately involved in what's called the TL junction. And the TL junction is where the thoracic spine or the mid back meets the low back. And that's a very key part because we really want to be able to make that rolling motion. And then you roll first with your shoulders, then your trunk comes, and then lastly your hips come. And so that's happening in that thoracic to that lumbar spine or that low back in that junction area. If we're carrying a lot of tension in there, that's going to be very difficult. And so the next thing is tummy time and rolling over. From there, we start to activate our core. This is a key spot that a lot of kiddos get caught up on because a lot of kiddos get diagnosed with low tone, especially in their core. And this is important because this is when motor milestones really start to kind of peak. It's about when people start to notice, hey, is my child hitting this milestone? Is my child not hitting this milestone? Do we need to reach out to something like PT or OT, chiropractic, etc.? And this is really when we start to say, okay, why is my child really not hitting this sitting up goal? And so this is when we start to notice low tone or a weak core, which makes it very difficult for kiddos to be able to sit up. And that's because sitting up takes core activation. Now, this has a lot to do with the fact that these kiddos, and that's why it's all progression. Everything goes step by step by step. And so the same kiddos that had too much tension in their neck, that couldn't properly latch, maybe had some jaw stuff going on, maybe a lip or tongue tie, the same kiddo who can't go into tummy time because they can't get their head and their mid-back into extension, had too much tension in their neck and in their shoulders, now has not enough tension in their core. And this is key because we talk about it as a low tone issue when oftentimes the low tone issue comes as a result of too much and too long of high tone in another area, where the body has used so many resources in a different area that it becomes fatigued or exhausted. Our body is meant to push and our body is meant to pull. Our body is meant to push the gas pedal and then push the brake pedal. So we're meant to exercise and relax. We're meant to stress and relax. And so this should be this balance of when we push, we also rest. And there's this intricate balance in that. But what happens is when we have too much tension, we have areas of high tension, prolonged, it becomes exhausting to the system because the body is working so hard and producing so much energy to facilitate those tight muscles that over time we start to see it shut down in other areas to then allocate those resources. So we really start to see the shutdown. And that's when we start to see we haven't properly been able to go into tummy time, etc. And now we're starting to notice low tone in their core, difficulty sitting up on their own, etc. So that's one of the things we start to notice. From there, they go into crawling. And so we want to be able to army crawl. We want to be able to regularly crawl. And that's essential for brain development. Like we kind of mentioned earlier, cross crawling is essential for brain development. It's awesome how cool it is and how that sends different signals to the brain. But we're really starting to say, okay, how are we building the brain development? And in turn, how that impacts later on behavior, emotion, etc. All the different things that we're going to see, speech, all the things down the road. And so right now we're focusing on motor, but because everything happens in sequence, these all are very key indicators for us to unlock that potential moving forward. And so we always have to look at the body as a whole. We always have to look at the body as a global unit versus really isolating that speech is independent from motor milestones, when speech is very intricately dependent on even the muscle strength in the mouth or behavior and emotion. If our body is worn out, our body is exhausted, our body has too much tension, then when we see emotional dysregulation, what happens is we notice that the body has been so exhausted for so long that these kiddos are so close to the edge, their body doesn't have that bandwidth. So we measure that in what's called HRV, or your adaptability to stress. But they're so close, they have so much energy their body is using to keep up with this high tone, or these areas of too much tension, that they're so close to that tipping point versus having that regulation space, or that bandwidth, or that slack in the rope. And that's something we see emotionally pop up, which really is rooted in the fact that overall the whole system has too much energy. So we can't separate and say that emotion, behavior, speech, etc., and movement milestones are not very intricately connected. And so that's why a lot of these motor milestones are so important for everything else. And so after they're crawling, like I said, that's brain development, very important. It's also why kiddos that skip crawling and go straight to walking, it's really not something that we should praise. We should really prioritize focusing on crawling. That can be something where people feel like, my child's so advanced. That's also something, going back to baby's ability to hold their head up and head and neck control. It's also one of the number one things we hear in a pediatric chiropractic office about newborns, that, oh my goodness, my child is so advanced, they can hold their head up. A newborn should not be able to hold their head up. A newborn should be nice and relaxed and floppy. They should not have high muscle tone. And if they do, that's a sign of tension, especially in the head and the neck. And that presents itself as infant torticollis, difficulty latching, tension in the jaw, potentially even some ties going on in there. But that is if your newborn is holding their head up, or you feel like they're stiff as a board, or they frequently arch, those are signs of high tension. And so that is not something that we should be praising kiddos for. Instead, that should be something we're giving them support. So I regress a little bit to go into the holding their head up. But like I said, people who say, oh, my child went straight to walking and didn't crawl, that's also not something that we should celebrate, because crawling is very important. So then we get to the next one, and that's eventually when they start to cruise and they start to walk. And that really is the intricacy of the entire system moving together. And what that really is, even from a brain development perspective, and everything in coordination, the muscle tone properly developing, and all of our different muscles to be able to engage and to activate and to move freely. And so movement really is life. It is vital that our bodies stay moving. It's something that creates blood flow to our muscles and our organs. It's something that actually lubricates our joints. And so we want to make sure we're hitting some good milestones, but also because as kiddos, when we're seeing indicators that some of these milestones may be delayed, or seeing difficulty in certain milestones, or some of these red flags that pop up, if we can get them the support they need early, that's something that we can set them up for so much more success moving forward. Because when we see signs of high tension, that's something that does not get resolved unless we support them. What happens is when we have high tension and we ignore it or we don't address it, it just turns into other issues. And so, like we were talking about, it can turn into a weak core. And then later on, missed milestones then start to affect behavior, emotional regulation, speech, movement, etc. And so when we start to see these, it's why we talk about that you don't grow out of things. And to say, oh, they'll grow out of things or they'll grow out of it, it's not something that is really truly fair to say to the kiddos, because things are presenting for a reason. And we shouldn't ignore those as indicators. We should say, why is this presenting? So, for example, say there's chronic ear infections. Why do they have ear infections? What may be going on? Because what may be going on is it can be a drainage problem. It can be a congestion problem. It can also be there's a muscle in your ear that also can be too tight, given that they probably also have too much tension in their neck. They may have had too much tension in their jaw. They may have had difficulty latching. They may also have a tie, these different things. And that may be one of the reasons why they're having a hard time draining, because the muscles in their ear are actually too tight. And so that's one of those things where we're saying, well, what are some of these other indicators? Instead of just saying, okay, well, the answer to an ear infection is an antibiotic. And there aren't times and places for antibiotics, but instead of saying, oh, they should just get tubes, or oh, they'll eventually grow out of them, well, are we looking to say, well, that same kiddo may have been the same kiddo that had infant torticollis that now we're seeing later is showing up as ear infections, and then later maybe behavior. And so we really want to say, instead of dismissing symptoms, we want to say, why are these symptoms presenting and how can we address them, because everything is interconnected. And so that's one of the things we like to be able to look at. And we love to be able to look at scans in our office, because scans in our office tell us so much, especially for kiddos. So how do kiddos get tension? That's a great place for us to start, because oftentimes people will say, how does my newborn have so much tension they're stiff as a board and they can hold their head up? Like, what have they experienced to have so much stress in their life thus far? And that's a great question. And one of the main things we talk about is the birthing process. Even a smooth delivery without any interventions places a lot of stress on baby's body. And that's because their body has very little muscle tone, and it's a very physically dramatic process. And that's something that is very beautiful in its own right, and something that obviously is very natural, but it's a lot of stress. Now, that alone is a lot of stress. But what we're seeing happen is that in a modern day society, we have taken birth interventions to an extreme. And so we have gotten to a place where we are seeing more and more extreme interventions that are creating more and more stress and tension on baby. And especially because baby is pulled out by their head and their neck. And that's why we see tension. Number one place we see tension, in the head and in the neck. And baby is literally pulled out by their head and their neck. Especially in the case of a C-section, the amount of pressure that's put on baby's spine, the compressive tension and pressure on baby's spine from their head and their neck, is huge. And it's more so than a traditional vaginal delivery. And even in a traditional vaginal delivery, there's even people that say that actually is baby's first chiropractic adjustment. That actually going through the birthing canal is very important for spinal development and for alignment and for baby's body in that. So basically nature is always right, which is funny that our bodies innately know, and that was designed for a reason. But there are reasons why we need C-sections, and there are times when we need C-sections. But it's important to recognize that when baby is being pulled out, that's a lot of pressure and a lot of tension on baby's head and shoulders, way more so than a traditional vaginal delivery. That's not to say, though, in instances of vaginal deliveries where we are twisting baby, or we eventually need vacuum or forceps because baby gets stuck. That's not to say that that is not also a massive amount of tension and stress on baby's body. And so, and not in all cases is a C-section the most amount of tension. There are other things like vacuum, forceps, etc. And so ultimately, what I'm saying is the more interventions, the more tension on baby's body. And like I said, the key is a happy, healthy baby. So ideally, the goal of these interventions is that they exist for the sake of a happy, healthy baby in the long run, that the goal is for a safe delivery. But that is not to say that there is not an additional amount of stress and tension placed on babies' bodies. And because the rate has increased, C-sections, I think, are almost at 40%, and depending on the hospital you go to. And so that's to say the amount of tension and the amount of these interventions have only just increased. And so if we're increasing these, we're also increasing inductions. Inductions are used with Pitocin. Pitocin increases the intensity of contractions. And if you think that baby doesn't experience that, baby also experiences mom's mental and emotional stress. So if we're increasing the intensity of contractions, that's something that baby is directly going to feel. Not to mention the increase in mom's heart rate, etc., that's also passed along to baby. And so when we're increasing inductions, we're inducing through something called Pitocin. Pitocin increases the intensity. And therefore, we're seeing all these different factors where we're increasing the intensity of something that's already pretty physically intense, especially for baby's body with very low muscle tone. So that is to say, where is baby getting this tension? So we see these milestones delayed. We see, okay, it might be because there's too much tension in their neck. There might be not enough tension or not enough tone in the core. But where is baby getting tension? And baby's getting tension from the birthing process, from interventions, and from mental and emotional stress in utero. So was there a high-risk pregnancy? Was mom stressed? Especially coming out of an age of, COVID babies where moms were really worried. There was a lot of unknown. And that's to no fault of moms at all. But there was a season where moms were not sure if they could even have, their partner in the hospital room while they were delivering. And so there was a lot of stress in that. And that's something where we saw as a society, we were globally as a society more stressed out than ever. And I would say even still in 2024, we are more stressed out than ever as a collective. And so that's something maternal stress and cortisol crosses the placenta. And so that's something that baby can also experience. And then the third thing that baby can experience that can contribute to this tension is environmental stress. And I've seen in my most extreme example of a kiddo adopted who was exposed to different substances from their adopted parents, and that's something their body had to filter and flush out. But in other ways, there's lots of things in this environment, whether that be environmental pollution, whether that be our food system, etc. And the higher toxic load or toxic stress we have is something we have to filter. And so that's something for us to be mindful of. And so those are the ways that we can contribute to tension or why we would see tension in a baby. And so the last thing is in our office, we do scans because that's the only way we can quantify how much tension we're really looking at and how much tension that your child really has for us to be able to quantify and also properly support. And so that's one of the ways where we can say we can look deeper. We don't necessarily have to wait until your child can't activate their core in sitting. We can say, hey, you know what? Early, let's address this. Let's focus on this because we want to set them up for success. Because like we said, you don't grow out of it unless it's addressed. Adults, the same thing. If we ignore our bodies, we ignore our tension, eventually our body gets to a point where it sends us a red flag, whether that be in acute pain or shutting down. Eventually the body says, I need you to listen. And so with kiddos, the fact that we can get to them so early and support them is so important for just optimal growth and development. Because when they're stuck in this high tension or high stress, we can't be in growth and survival at the same time. And so if our body is focused on survival or high tension, our body cannot also be allocating those resources for growth and development. And so we want baby to be nice and relaxed so that they're able to move from a place of optimal growth and development. So one of the key scans we look at, especially in our kiddos, it's called an EMG, and it measures muscle activity. It measures how much energy is your body using to maintain posture. So what muscles are using too much energy? What muscles aren't using enough and are fatigued? And how can we quantify that and where can we see that throughout the spine? And it gives us a total energy number which is so fascinating. And we see a lot of our ADHD kiddos, a lot of our sensory kiddos, behavior kiddos. That EMG number is through the roof. That's a high number. And we see a lot of tension in that system. And there's so much we can do to intervene now to set them up for success. So if you are wondering if your child has too much tension or not enough tension in different areas, if your child is stressed out or worn out, let us scan them and see how their body is doing. We look forward to seeing you at Sun Life Chiropractic, and I hope this video was helpful to you. And if it was helpful, drop something that you've learned in today's video in the comments.